We use Bixi, our city's public bike share service, a lot. We looked up our stats recently and found that I've averaged 2 rides per day over the past 6 months.
3.5 rides a day for me.
Bixi has been breaking records every year for the past decade, aside from the COVID blip. We've mentioned our love of bike share in a few videos and are surprised that the Netherlands, one of the most bike-friendly countries in the world, doesn't have this seemingly essential service. We learned that a lot of Dutch people are kind of baffled by the concept, so in this video we're going to make the case for bike share, but also consider if there are any reasons it might be less relevant in the Netherlands.
By far, the most common response from Dutch people we got was that they already own a bike, often multiple. Why do you need bike rentals when you have your own bike? A lot of people use the term bike rental, but we see 2 different categories here. To us, a rental is when you pay to use a bike for a set period of time, like the Dutch Feats, where you pay just under €5 to rent a bike for 24 hours and return it to the same location at the end, or pay a fee. With bike share, while you can pay for a single trip, the killer deal is a longer-term pass. We pay under €10 a month for unlimited 45-minute rides, which means that each time we pick up a bike, it's free if we stay under that time limit. Each trip being free makes a big difference in how you end up using it. Another major ingredient to bike share is that you can return the bike to any station near your destination, unlike bike rentals, which usually require returning it to the same location.
We're still left with the question, what's the point of bike share if you own your own bike? Well, some people do use it as a substitute for owning. In Vancouver, 3 in 10 bike share users and 4 in 10 super users don't own a bike. But that still leaves the majority of bike share users who pay for and use the service despite owning a bike at home, including us. We have 2 bikes each, which we mainly use for longer rides, especially recreational bike trips. For most routine short to medium distance cycling within our city, we find that bike share is just the more flexible and convenient option. We've talked about folding bikes before, which offer a lot of flexibility, like being able to take your bike on transit. Imagine if you could fold a bike down to a size where it could fit into your pocket and weigh nothing. How convenient would that be? That's kind of like what bike share is like. Since getting bike share passes, we find ourselves not really using our folding bikes that much anymore.
Bike share lets you hop on a bike whenever you feel like it and use it for part of your trip without lugging it around for the whole trip. Maybe you bike to work, meet up with some coworkers, and all head over to a bar or restaurant on foot. Then you can bike or take transit home. Maybe you want to go to the library, but the closest metro station is over here. When you get out of the metro, just hop on bike share and turn a longer walk into a shorter bike ride. Maybe you walk to a store in your neighborhood and it started to rain, so you prefer a 5-minute bike ride home instead of a 15-minute walk. Maybe you want to go for a 30-minute jog in one direction and take a bike back instead of turning around halfway through. Because each bike share trip is free, once you have the option to pick up a bike from virtually anywhere, you start to find a lot of uses for it.
Another big reason we use bike share despite owning our own bikes is that it lets us opt out of worrying about bike theft. Our bikes aren't especially fancy or expensive, but it's still a few $100s on the line, plus our mobility. Sometimes people steal parts of your bike, like a seat or a wheel, and it's as confusing as it is inconvenient. We don't have to worry about theft quite as much now that we live in a more residential neighborhood, instead of more highly trafficked parts of downtown, but theft is still enough of an annoyance, so we're happy to pay about €10 a month for the option to have a guaranteed theft-free cycling experience whenever we want, especially if we're heading downtown and would be leaving our bikes there. On top of this, like a lot of other people, theft and weather lead us to keep our bikes inside our apartment instead of on the street. Especially if you have to deal with stairs or an elevator or a cat, this adds extra friction to using your own bike. For shorter trips, it's usually more convenient to just take a bike from a nearby station on the street.
You also don't have to worry about maintenance on bike share, especially in winter. Admittedly, this isn't as relevant in the Netherlands, but in Canada we have between 2 and 5 months each year where the roads can be dirty with snow, salt, and slush. With good road treatment, winter cycling can absolutely be safe, but it's hard to avoid it being messy, and that can do a number on your bike. We know people in Toronto who use bike share through winter for that reason, and we're excited for Montreal to extend bike share through this winter too. One of the reasons we bought folding bikes is that they're easier to clean and maintain through winter, but now that's probably being replaced by bike share for us. Finally, bike share in a lot of cities lets you access e-bikes. You do have to pay an extra per-minute fee, so it's not the same model of free rides, but it's really convenient if you don't own an e-bike yourself, or you want to use one without worrying about theft. Bixby is also working on offering cargo bikes, probably under a similar model.
Bike share does have negatives. This is a reliable step-through 3-speed that should work pretty well for most people, but it's not the same as going out and finding the best bike for you. Maybe you want more gears, less weight, or a rack on the back instead of the front. I personally find that the seats don't go as high as I'd like on some models. It's hardly a deal breaker for these short trips, but you might be more picky. The second big downside is that the system needs to be well managed. Bikes need to be maintained and transferred around. We've had overall good experiences here in Montreal. It's rare to have trouble finding a bike, or to get a bike that's out of service. But if your city isn't on top of this stuff, the experience can suffer. Another thing to consider is that bike share might not work as well in lower density areas, because the stations will need to be more spread out. Suburban areas in North America don't usually have bike share, although it's hard to tell how much of that is the lower densities, versus how much of it comes from the less developed bike infrastructure and bike culture. Finally, we should mention that bike share systems are usually subsidized to some extent. Subsidies in Toronto cover 23% of the operating budget, or $2.5 million a year. That seems like a great deal for the service provided, and it's hardly anything compared to other transportation subsidies, but it is something to mention.
Despite some downsides, we think the case for bike share is pretty strong. Are any of the advantages not relevant in the Netherlands? Every source we can find seems to say that bike theft is a serious problem in the Netherlands. One study left 100 bikes locked up in public in Amsterdam for half a year, and most of them got stolen, often ending up in used bike shops around the region. That's pretty bad, and it would suggest that Dutch people might benefit from bike share to avoid theft. There are two differences, though. The Dutch have had regulations mandating ground-level bike parking in new homes since about 1950, so likely fewer of them keep their bikes inconveniently inside their apartment to avoid theft like we do. Also, it seems like the Dutch have a bigger ecosystem of cheap second-hand bikes. We've heard people getting them for as low as €60. You wonder how many of these are stolen, but still, cheap second-hand bikes might provide some competition with bike share.
One common concern we heard was that bike share docks just take up too much space. We don't think that's true, especially when they're doubled up, but remember that multiple people use each bike every day. You also don't have the problem of abandoned bikes or even long-term storage. These bikes are always in service. A lot of the Dutch people we talked to didn't seem to see the appeal of the multimodal trip flexibility of a bike share system. But to be honest, we didn't realize how useful it would be before we tried it either. When the membership is cheap and each ride is free, it's easy to find contexts where hopping on a bike is useful. One day recently, I took a Bixby for an 8-kilometer ride to a different neighborhood. Dropped it off and did some errands in the neighborhood on foot that left me 2 kilometers from where I dropped the bike. I then picked up a Bixby from there and took it to a metro station. Took the metro to the station closest to our home. Then I got another Bixby for the last mile. Mixing walking, cycling, and transit on that trip easily beat just taking transit or just lugging my bike around.
One thing that surprised us on our Netherlands trip was how many people we saw riding 2 per bike. While charming and unique, it made us wonder if they might benefit from cheap and convenient bike share. Another puzzle for us was Feats, a bike rental service offered by the National Railway, intended as a last-mile solution to public transit. You pay just under €5 to take a bike for 24 hours, returning it at the same station when you're done. According to one study, the typical weekday Feats user is getting off a train, hopping on one of these, and cycling 3 kilometers or 10 minutes from the station to work, then back at the end of the day. Here's a common last-mile commute in Eindhoven from the study. To us, this seems like the perfect use case for a 30 or 45-minute bike share service. A 24-hour rental like Feats seems like overkill when you're just going to use it for a total of 20 to 30 minutes. And almost €5 a day seems like a heavy addition to a commuting budget. Like we said, bike share in our city is about €10 a month. Not too far from the Netherlands, Antwerp has a bike share program for just €5 a month. Granted, many employers cover the cost of OV Feats, but it still feels like a weird solution to the last mile problem. To be clear though, this doesn't mean it's a bad service overall. It's a great deal for tourists and day trippers who actually need a bike for a full day, although unfortunately OV Feats isn't available to foreigners. We would have loved to have access to these on our trip instead of using hotel rentals.
We also had some Dutch people tell us that we're being arrogant for going to their country with our North American mindset and expecting things like bike share that just don't fit into their local needs. That might be true. Many of them pointed out that some private companies have tried bike share there, and they haven't been super successful, so there isn't much of a reason to set up a public system. But here's the thing. We're used to hearing the same responses when we argue for Dutch-style bike infrastructure in North America. Canadians and Americans tell us, that's all fine for Europe, but we don't need it here. Or it's just not part of our culture. Or we built some bike lanes, but they didn't get a lot of use. The potential for bike share in the Netherlands is obviously a different question, but we wanted to use this opportunity to make the case for bike share and think through the strengths and weaknesses. The Netherlands obviously does a lot right when it comes to cycling, but other places can have good ideas too.
In the end, we do think that public bike share would be useful in the Netherlands, but we also see some differences that make it less essential, like Dutch people having better bike storage at home, the fact that they have a bigger marketplace of cheap used bikes available, and the fact that lots of employers pay for OV Feats. Maybe more importantly, public bike share is a way for governments to promote cycling and make it exceptionally simple, cheap, and convenient for citizens, at the cost of money, infrastructure, and logistics on their part. In a country where cycling rates are already really high, a public bike share system might be useful, but further down the list of priorities. But we do hope that, next time we're back in the country, OV Feats is available to foreigners too. It might not be the perfect last-mile solution for commuters, but it would have been great for us.
Thanks for watching through to the end of the video. Don't forget to bike and subscribe.